In this presentation, we're going to talk about error when conducting hypothesis testing. And primarily what we're going to do is we're going to talk about two types of error that we see. So type 1 and type 2. In hypothesis testing, let's say we have a population that has a parameter that is unknown, and we don't know the mean of that parameter. In order to make a decision about that, what this parameter is, we make hypotheses. So almost always, hypotheses take the following form. So as we've seen in previous videos, we know that the null hypothesis, which is H naught, basically states that the mean is equal to mu naught. And this mean is an actual value, so it's the actual mean of the population that is essentially unknown to us. The second hypothesis we can make, which is the alternative hypothesis, states that mu, again this is our actual mean for our population, is not equal to mu naught. And what we want to do is decide if mu naught is the value of the unknown mean. So essentially what we do is we say, okay, is it not the value of the unknown mean? So that would be our alternative hypothesis. Or is it the value of the unknown mean? And in that case, it's our null hypothesis. So to do this, what we do is we actually go in and we collect data from our population, so we collect a sample, and let's say we have data x1, x2 through x of n, and then using this data we calculate what we call a test statistic, z naught or t naught, and that just depends on the type of test we're conducting. And from this test statistic that we generate from our data, we can sort of test or make a decision about whether or not our null hypothesis or alternative hypothesis is true. So let me show what that decision-making process actually looks like. So the best way to show it is through this nifty little chart. And on this side of the chart is what is actually true. And in our case, what is actually true could be the null hypothesis, or it could be that alternative hypothesis. And then on this part of the chart, it's sort of what we decide. So this is what we decide in our hypothesis test. So our first decision is to accept H naught. So that means that we accept the null hypothesis as being true, or we reject it, which essentially means that we reject the null hypothesis as being true. And so you can see here that if we accept the null hypothesis and the null hypothesis actually ends up being true, then this is correct. And you can see here that if we we do reject the null hypothesis, which essentially means that we've accepted the alternative hypothesis, again, it's correct. However, there are two instances where we can have what we call error. And that is, let's say, if we reject the null hypothesis, but it turns out that the null hypothesis is true, and so this is error, and we call this type 1. So let me write that out. So type 1, you reject the null, but null is actually true. And then our other case of error occurs when we accept the null hypothesis, but it turns out that the alternative hypothesis is correct. And we call that a type 2 error. So let me write this out again so you can see it. So again, in a type 2, we accept the null hypothesis, but the alternative hypothesis is true. In practice, hypothesis testing is set up so that your null hypothesis such that if we is true, such that we can compute the probability density. In practice, we set up the null hypothesis such that we can compute probability density of the test statistic, again, our Z naught or T naught, depending on what test we're conducting, when the null hypothesis is true. And then we can use that probability density to find the probability of a type 1 error. And the reason why we do that is that it sort of allows us to construct our decision making to give us an acceptable type 1 error. So to make us feel like, you know, that so that we know that we have minimized the amount of error as much as possible when we're trying to go through our decision-making process. So I hope you have a better understanding of error in hypothesis testing. Thanks.